What is up, everyone? I'm Blaiden Kirk. You're watching Stay Hot, and today I'm going to be going over my top 10 quarterbacks from the 2010s. For those that haven't been following along recently with the videos that I've been putting out, I've been going through somewhat of a rendition of the concept of an all-decades team. I did my top 10 receivers from the 2010s, and I did my top 10 edge rushers. And I'm just going position by position and doing top 10s. Simple enough. And I have sort of established a trend that I do want to keep following in this series, which is taking into account how dominant players were at their peak, how consistent they were throughout the decade, and were you able to win some awards. Now, obviously, we're talking about quarterbacks. There's a little bit more nuance that goes into it, so I'm going to try my best. And you know what? Every once in a while, I go and look at other people's lists after I make mine, and I always feel a little bit better because I read their lists online. I'm like, these are terrible. So it always makes me feel a little bit better when I read other people's top 10 players throughout the decade. Let's hop right into number 10. I think there are a few guys that you could put in this spot. I decided to go with Ben Roethlisberger, and we can talk about the statistics of it. He had like 37,000 passing yards, 230 touchdowns. Like, he was fine. It was like nothing insanely off the wall, but like very, very productive, very good. Put the Steelers in a good position to be a good football team there in this decade, and they were. But the reason that he's going to go higher than even some guys that were more productive than him is just because he was a freak, right? He was like physically just ridiculous. Forget this time period for a second. How many guys ever stack up physically to Ben Roethlisberger as far as like frame and just like pure size of a human being? You take that, put it on top of the fact that he had one of the fastest releases in the NFL. It's no shocker that he didn't take a lot of sacks. He was also just a guy that had great poise, and he was a great leader. So I'm really shocked that that team with Ben Roethlisberger and Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, and they had Mike Tomlin still coaching, like all those guys together didn't win a Super Bowl. That's crazy to me. Now we're moving on to number 9, where I have Philip Rivers, who was pretty much just the epitome of consistency at the quarterback position during this decade. First of all, he was an Iron Man. He played 160 out of a possible 160 games in the regular season during this decade. No one else did that. Not Rodgers, not Brady, not Brees, no one. He's top 5 in yards for this decade, and one of 4 guys to have over 40,000 passing yards during this decade. He's top 5 in touchdowns. And I mentioned this with like Larry Fitzgerald too in the wide receivers video, and I'm trying to be consistent with my logic, which is like, even if I don't see you as this super high level player, in my eyes, I think if you are consistently putting up good numbers every single season, no matter what, you deserve credit for that, because it's really hard to do. People are like, oh, well, he only did it because he played a lot of games. It's like, that's hard to do. There's a reason no one else did it. Moving on to number 8, I have the first of our MVPs, Matt Ryan. Matty Ice, baby. And just like Philip Rivers, Matt Ryan stacked the box scores. And it's funny, but it's honestly kind of sad that Matt Ryan and Philip Rivers will probably go down with Dan Marino as the only quarterbacks to be top 10 in all-time passing yards and not have a Super Bowl. It's tough, but at least Matt Ryan got an MVP, so that gives him a slight edge over Philip Rivers, I think. Okay, I think at this point, I just stopped caring about stats. So number 7, I have Matthew Stafford, and a lot of people not only would, but actually do leave him off of their top 10 quarterbacks of the 2010s. I know because I looked it up, and pardon my French, but that's fucking crazy to me. Okay, maybe it's not that crazy. Like, I do understand the Lions were bad. I just don't care. I think about it this way. Before Patrick Mahomes, Stafford was up there with guys like Rodgers and Russell Wilson as one of those guys that could just unlock a superpower, I swear, with his arm. Stafford was that crazy. He was nasty with it, and there were only like a handful of guys I think that you could have dropped in Detroit in that same situation, and they would have performed as well as Stafford did. I don't know how often you all think about the 2019 season where the Lions start off 3-4-1, like they're a pretty respectable team, and then Matt Stafford goes down. He's hurt, and the Lions don't win another game after that. They finished the year 3-12-1. Now, I know you could point and say that most teams would be marginally worse without their starting quarterback, right? We see how the Ravens fare with Lamar Jackson. But honestly, when we start doing this list again for the 2020s, you act like I'm not going to say the same shit for Lamar. It's like, oh my God, bro, like without Lamar Jackson, that team's terrible. Like, they stink. But they didn't stink nearly as bad as this Lions team did. They were terrible without Stafford. It's so painfully obvious how necessary Matthew Stafford was to this offense and this team, but we're all like, they weren't the greatest show on turf, and that's Matthew Stafford's fault, so we're leaving him off. And it's not even like he wasn't putting up numbers. He had 39,000 total yards during this decade. That's 5th. He had 243 touchdowns during this decade. That's 6th. Just like a complete gamer, makes crazy arm angle throws, and we're just like, yeah, no, he's not top 10. Wild. But that's enough Matthew Stafford dick riding for one day. Let's move on to number 6, Peyton Manning, who is another MVP on this list. And if we were talking about the top 10 quarterbacks from the 2000s, he might be number 1. But we're not, and he retired in 2015, so... And they did win the Super Bowl, him and the Broncos, in that 2015 season, but like, we all know that Peyton Manning was not the root of that win. So I'm not going to lie to you, Peyton Manning does not have that much merit to be this high on this list, but there are a few things that for me matter a lot. The first thing I think is somewhat obvious, he breaks the touchdown record. 55 is crazy. At 37, even crazier. But I think it's my second point that really sets Peyton Manning apart, and it's how impressive he was when he came back from one of the worst sports injuries I've seen in my lifetime. Let's just look at this timeline event and how wild this is. Horrific neck injury at 35, leaves you without feeling in your fingertips. Comes back the next year to throw 4,600 yards, 37 touchdowns, and only 11 picks. Oh, and he led the league in completion percentage on a new team. And then only 2 years removed from this injury, break the record for most passing touchdowns in an NFL season. But not just break it, you shatter it. Peyton Manning was so good that he transcended the possibility of a career-ending neck injury to then continue playing outstanding football. It's like God had a plan and the sheriffs just said no. That was a bit corny, but it's a perfect segue into our next guy, number 5, Russell Wilson. I used to love watching Russell Wilson, man. He was crazy. He was just a complete gamer. And like I mentioned with Matthew Stafford, prime Russell Wilson was as good as anybody, and it felt like he could make any play in any situation into a highlight reel. Oh, the interior of your offensive line just vacated you and you have nowhere to go? Oh, let me run 15 yards backwards, make all 3 of them miss, and then throw like a 40-yard bomb to Doug Baldwin. I know he's never had an MVP vote, and I know the statistics aren't that crazy for him, but Russell Wilson is only properly experienced by watching him. So that's the only advice I can give you. If you know, you know. And honestly, it's kind of similar for number 4 on my list, Cam Newton. I think there's a reason they called him Superman. Physically, I don't think you could have built a better quarterback in a lab. He was like a dream scenario, a master class on how to design a quarterback as a specimen. I wrote down just like a billion attributes here. Great size, perfect frame, amazing athleticism, fantastic runner, huge arm, could make all the throws. Honestly, I should have just tried to go with some more alliteration here. And honestly, I'm mad that I didn't because I'm reading amazing athleticism. I could have done fantastic frame. This is on me. I should have been better. But I think sadly, the Panthers are going to go down as the blueprint for how not to use a quarterback of this caliber. It's honestly so crazy how the Panthers basically just asked Cam Newton to do everything straight from the jump. I feel like I almost never see guys just completely change an offense from being one of the worst in the league to one of the best in the league basically overnight. But that's what Cam did. And then he goes on to win an MVP with Ted Ginn as his best wide receiver. And that's how it was his entire career. No receivers, bad offensive line. He went to work. He did all the work all the time until he eventually got hurt. But a healthy, prime Cam Newton was one of the most electric players in the NFL. And I talked in my receivers video about the reason why I had Odell so high is because of his impact and the fact that he was the face of the league for 2 years. Cam Newton is the exact same way. Now with these last 3 guys, you kind of all know who they are, so I'll try and be quick about it. At number 3, I have Drew Brees, who is pretty much the most statistically insane quarterback of this decade, and is honestly one of the most statistically insane quarterbacks ever. But we're just focusing on this decade, of course. Number 1 in yards, number 1 in touchdowns, basically untouchable in that category. And I think the only reason why Brees never won anything in this decade, no MVPs, no Super Bowls, bro, some of the defenses that they were playing with, terrible. They were awful. Dog shit. The word, think of every negative adjective you can think of, those were those Saints defenses. People talk about Rodgers having bad defenses during this time. Brees was struggling out there, man. But speaking of Aaron Rodgers, I have him at number 2, and I went back and forth on whether or not I would put Brees or Rodgers at 2, and it was really close for me. I did eventually decide to give Rodgers the edge for a few reasons. First of all, he's like the most talented thrower of a football ever pre-Mahomes. That's how we're going to start like referencing time from now on, is like how many years before Patrick Mahomes? 20 years before Mahomes. I think, of course, you also have to bring up the 2 MVPs that Aaron Rodgers has during this decade, though I think you can make a strong case that Drew Brees deserved one of those in 2011. But I really think it just comes down to Rodgers was the smoothest, the most precise, the most, deadly thrower of a football through this decade. Like, no one was better at it than him. But I do want to bring up one more crazy Aaron Rodgers stat just before we move on to number 1, which is just how few interceptions he threw in comparison to everyone else on this list. So Aaron Rodgers had 63 interceptions from 2010 to 2019. That's incredibly low. That's ridiculously low. Matt Ryan had 122. Phillip Rivers had 153, my bad. Drew Brees had 127, and Peyton Manning had 70. He retired in 2015. Oh, and one more thing before we get to number 1, I do want to give honorable mentions to Eli Manning and Andrew Luck. And if you wanted to put those guys, I think at number 10, or maybe even get both of them on that list, I think I would be okay with it. I just couldn't find a way to justify it. But if you want to, that's all you, but not on my list. But we're finally here at number 1, and honestly, I've put away my notes because you all know who this is. It's Tom Brady, and honestly, I could live without the Super Bowls. The reason why he's number 1 on this list is because no one was as good as Brady was for as long as Brady was. There were moments where maybe Rodgers had the edge, or maybe even Brees had the edge. There were moments where Brady was not undisputed the best quarterback in the NFL, but he was always there. He was always top 3, top 5, all the time. And no one else has that consistency, and thus no one else is going to be number 1. And it's the same reasoning for why I think he's the greatest quarterback of all time. The longevity is just unmatched. Again, I could live without the Super Bowls. He could have 0 of them. No one else was as good as Brady was for as long as he was. But that's my top 10 list. Let's see if I can remember it off the top of my head. Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, Matt Ryan, Matthew Stafford, I'm doing good, Peyton Manning, Russell Wilson, Cam Newton, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady. Honorable mentions, Eli Manning, Andrew Luck. But I appreciate you all for tuning in. It means a lot. Make sure you check out Matt and Theo's content. Make sure you check out all the content here on Stay Hot. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the flippity flop.